The Magi visit the Messiah. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
In this morning's passage, we have the wise men, the Magi, these exotic characters which Christmas tradition has been fascinated with, but never quite sure what to do with them. We sing, "We three kings from the Orient are," except that they were not kings. We have no evidence that they were free, only that they brought free gifts. We love the Christmas pageant of the wise men and the shepherds, except actually the wise men were not there at the same time as the shepherds, and they did not give their gifts to baby Jesus, as they turn up somewhere between 1 or 2 years after the shepherds. And we know that because the word used to describe Jesus is that when the Magi come, is that of a toddler who is about up to the age of 2. And so they probably came and visited Jesus, no longer in a manger in Joseph's family house, but in Joseph's and Mary's own home. Well, now I've got perhaps what you might call a Scrooge moment out of my system. We can turn perhaps to some of the things that this passage teaches us. It teaches us about Jesus and foreigners. In the first chapter, Matthew has emphasized Jesus' Jewish identity, how he's a son of Abraham, a descendant of the great King David. But if we remember, Abraham was promised by God that through his descendants, all the nations of the world are blessed. And Matthew actually in Jesus' genealogy includes foreign women to point to the fact that Jesus is the Savior for all the nations. And this is taken further in this passage as Jesus, as a child, a toddler, comes into contact with illustrious foreigners. And these foreigners are the Magi who bring us into the international politics of the time. There are questions about who they were. They were probably astrologers employed by the Persian Empire. We do not know what star they followed, and many theories have been presented. It's often a rite of passage at Christmas that someone presents another theory trying to guess what star it is. My own favorite theory is that God sent an angel to guide them in the form of a star, because often in the Old Testament, heavenly beings are described as stars. And the nature of the gift suggests that their intentions are political. They want to establish a good relationship with this new king of Israel, possibly seeing in him a potential ally against the Roman Empire. And as following the star, they turn up in Jerusalem and cause quite a commotion with their questions about a newly born king of Jews. After all, to announce the arrival of a new king is at the same time to declare the end of the reign of the current ruler. And the fact that is Jesus, the Jews at the time were ruled by a puppet king appointed by the Romans. This was Herod, and Herod was not a Jew. He was actually an Idumean, related to the Edomites, believed to be descended from Esau, Jacob's twin brother. Now, King Herod was a brutal man, and he was paranoid about his power. He had his own wife and 3 of his sons killed because he believed they were conspiring against him. Thus, when he becomes disturbed, we are told that the rest of Jerusalem became disturbed with him, wondering what new act of violence this development would bring. And so we're told that Herod comes up with this plan. He will pretend to be interested in knowing and even worshipping this new king, when in fact his plan is to kill the child. In a sense, it's the echoes of the world of international politics then and now. And it points to this dimension of the gospel. It announces the rule of a king, the arrival of a new kingdom which displaces existing powers and existing structures. It announces the formation of a new community, the church, where relationships are formed as an expression of the love that God has poured over his people, rather than based on economic or even family ties. But this passage is not just about foreigners, for the teachers of the law are consulted, and they declare that according to the prophet Micah, the Messiah would be born in the town of Bethlehem. They then proceed to do absolutely nothing. While the foreign magi have travelled all the way from the east, from Persia, to encounter the King of the Jews, his own people, these experts on the Jewish scriptures, are not prepared to make the short 5-mile journey to Bethlehem to check him out. Just as if with all their knowledge and all their erudition, they really do not expect God to send the Messiah. This stands as a warning to us of the danger we all face for all our professions of faith, of not really expecting God to do anything anymore, of becoming so passive in our relationship with the Lord. But Herod does not get his way. The Magi, after visiting Jesus, after worshipping, after giving him their gifts, are instructed in a dream to go home in another direction. So Herod comes up with a particularly brutal plan. He decided simply to kill all the boys aged under 2 in Bethlehem, echoing the violence of Pharaoh against the children of Israel at the time of the Exodus. Now Herod is unable to kill Jesus, for Joseph is warned by an angel in a dream to escape with Jesus and Mary to Egypt. But many children are killed. Now Bethlehem was a small village town at the time of Jesus, so you don't need to imagine that hundreds of boys were killed in this operation. Maybe somewhere between 6 and 20 boys may have been killed, and Herod would simply have written off as collateral damage. Most, in fact, as far as we know, all other first century historians, apart from Matthew, didn't find this a remarkable event in Herod's reign. Life was very violent in those days, hardly felt it was worth mentioned. Yet their deaths were not ignored by God. In fact, they are compared to one of the most tragic events in the history of Judah, when the nation was exiled to Babylon, which is the context of the quote that we get from the book of Jeremiah. This passage reminds us that Christmas is not a nice, cute story simply to tell little children. It is also a story of violence. It reminds us of the evil which other human beings do to other human beings, especially about what the rich and the powerful are willing to do to keep their wealth, to keep their power. It reminds us that there are many children who face ill health in this world, even die, because they do not have access to clean waters, do not have access to the cheap medicines that could keep them alive, of the thousands of abortions that take place in this country, of the way child poverty persists and in some places increasing. But this passage also reminds us that there is no acceptable collateral damage from God's perspective. There will have to be an accounting. So the passage tells us that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus go down to Egypt. Now, the choice of Egypt was probably down to practical issues. Herod did not rule over Egypt, and there was a sizable Jewish community in Egypt. In fact, there were more Jews living in the city of Alexandria than the population of Jerusalem. So Jesus becomes an immigrant, an asylum seeker, a refugee. Joseph leaves behind his career, any business that he might have set up. The gifts that they received from the Magi were probably spent to finance that journey down into Egypt, where Jesus, God incarnate, God with us, identifies with those who suffer, those who are vulnerable. And at the heart of the gospel is this incarnation, the idea that in God, Jesus came to be with us and shared in the suffering, in the vulnerability of the weakest, poorest human beings. At the heart of this passage is compassion, which literally means to be alongside, to suffer alongside, to suffer together. And the passage thus reminds us that when Jesus came to this world, he was not with the politicians, he was not with the scholars, the moguls, the newspaper editors. Yet for all the doom and gloom of this passage, it is above all else a passage of hope. Now, the first sign of hope comes in the way that the Magi worshipped Jesus. Now, they would have been frowned upon by many of Matthew's Jewish readers. Firstly, because they were involved in astrology, which is condemned in the Bible. And secondly, because they were spiritual descendants of the wise men of the Persian Empire who conspired to ensure that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, it is remarkable that Matthew presents them as the first to bow down and worship Jesus. This points to a miraculous act being carried out by God and prefigures a miracle that will take place in the book of Acts and beyond, when many Gentiles will come to recognize Jesus as Lord and Savior. There's a second sign of hope in a passage in the quotation, "Out of Egypt I called my son." This is taken from the book of Hosea. In Hosea, God is describing his love for the nation of Israel, which he describes as his son, and how he saved the people by delivering them from slavery in Israel. What Matthew means here by this quotation is simply that in Jesus, God is carrying out a new exodus, but one that is more powerful, one that is more significant than the first. Whereas in Moses, the people of Israel delivered from slavery in Egypt, in Jesus, all people can be delivered from their slavery to sin, to the devil, and to death. And there's a third sign of hope in this passage, in that Herod dies, and Joseph is able to take his family back to Nazareth, away from the reign of Herod's cruel but incompetent and less powerful son, Herod Archelaus. Hence, as far as we know, Jesus is able to grow up in relatively safe and peace, and lives until the start of his ministry what seemed to have been a rather unremarkable life, supporting his family as a carpenter. Herod dies, and in this world there are powerful, arrogant, and cruel people who do much to harm the lives of many, who do much to harm the lives of God people. Yet in the end, Hitler, Stalin, and many others all end up in the same place, the grave. Now, walk in the British Museum and you'll see all these monuments to powerful civilizations from the past. Each one has passed away, yet God remains, and only faith, hope, and love will endure. This story reminds us that we cannot look at life and deny the realities. We cannot simply come at Christmas and give fake, false comforts. That becomes nonsense. But it is still possible to look at the violence and suffering in chapter 2 of Matthew and see God at work. We are able also to look at the fears and sorrows of life in the presence and still trust that because of Jesus' death and resurrections, the powers of sin, death, and the devil have been defeated. And in that way, we can join in the famous prayer associated with the Judah of knowledge. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.